So as Corey mentioned, my topic is a targeted approach to improving the cool zone system in San Diego County for vulnerable populations. And I'll just jump right in. So San Diego is known for its beautiful weather. When I told people I was moving here from Boston, the first thing I heard was 70 and sunny all the time. It's gonna be great. That wasn't the case this year, but overall, it's true. However, in the past decade, San Diego has seen the now after last year, 6 warmest years on record. And with current emission projections, that's likely to keep continuing. In 2021, so hang on one sec. Historically, there have been 4 days of extreme heat per year. However, in 2021, there was 36 days of extreme heat, and last August's heat wave broke records for both duration and high temperatures. The question is, why does this all matter? Extreme heat is the deadliest climate-related hazard, resulting in more deaths than all other natural disasters combined. And in California, this looks like 599 deaths reported in the past decade from extreme heat. However, heat deaths are commonly underreported, and so the actual number is probably closer to 3,900, which is 6 times the amount of the reported. Unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to extreme heat. Before we move on, let's define extreme heat. Typically, it's days that are significantly hotter than average to the point of emergency designation by local officials. However, there's not really a common naming for extreme heat. They're also called heat waves, heat emergencies, and there actually isn't an agreed upon definition, which causes a lot of confusion when trying to plan for and message around extreme heat events. So why is heat so deadly? Part of it is that messaging piece. Additionally, warning systems based on national standards don't really work for regional temperature differences, so the alerts need to be happening sooner and based on what people are acclimated for in each region. And then people underestimate the impacts of heat on their health. People who are most vulnerable to extreme heat wouldn't often self-identify as being vulnerable to extreme heat. Heat impacts health in a number of different ways. But the most important is that heat compromises the body's ability to regulate temperature. We all know that this feels really uncomfortable, sweaty, but it goes much further than that. It impacts 7 different organ systems and can result in over 27 different negative health outcomes. Vulnerable populations have an increased risk of experiencing heat-related illness, which is why this study focuses specifically on those populations. And in San Diego County, there is a 14% increase in hospitalizations during extreme heat events. An important takeaway is that heat impacts everyone differently, and what is a mild inconvenience for some is a life-threatening event to others. There's good news, though. Death and illness from extreme heat are preventable, and the tools that are necessary to do that already exist. So let's kind of get into some of those strategies. The first line of defense are individual strategies. These are things like staying hydrated, not drinking alcohol, staying out of the sun. But as some of the previous projects have already addressed, inequalities prevent people from being able to access these types of interventions equally. And so it also takes community planning strategies to help mitigate and adapt to the effects of extreme heat. Mitigation is prevention, so this would be things like installing cool roofs, increasing urban green spaces, decreasing impervious surfaces, and then adaptation is how we can really adjust to what is happening right now to minimize the impacts. So that's things like activating cooling centers, improving access to public transit, and increasing public awareness about the dangers of extreme heat. When considering all of the available strategies, one strategy stands out as being the most necessary for survival. Access to AC is a top indicator for heat-related health impacts. Unfortunately, AC has a high energy demand, so in the process of cooling us down, they heat up the planet in the process. So they're effective but costly. Access to household AC is limited by initial high costs of purchasing and then operating costs resulting from high cost of energy. Personally, during the heat wave last year, when I operated my AC at home, even during only off-peak hours, my energy bill doubled, and the energy bills are already really high to begin with. And so because of the historically mild temperatures, only about 50% of households in San Diego have access to AC. So what about the other 50%? Cooling centers, or a cool zone as they're called in San Diego, are air-conditioned spaces that are open for free during heat emergencies. They can be located in libraries, recreation centers, schools, or other spaces with AC. However, they're not the most fun places to be, as typically they're just empty rooms with some chairs and not much else. So let's look at what this looks like in San Diego. At the end of 2022, there were 96 cooling centers being reported as operating, and each of those is represented by a blue dot on this map. For the purpose of this study, I decided to look at a 0.8-mile radius around each cool zone as the population, as our populations to consider. And this is because a lot of studies are done on the distribution and if they're lacking access, but if the cool zones that we already have aren't effective for the people that are closest to them, then what's the point in adding more if they're just gonna be more empty rooms? One other aspect of dealing with heat mitigation in San Diego County is that there's 3 diverse climate zones with this transition zone in green, and people living in each of these zones will have different acclimations to extreme heat. So the first thing that I looked at was accessibility by walking. The light blue shows what's actually walkable, or kind of theoretically walkable, in 15 minutes when it's not hot out. And so the service areas do provide pretty good access for people who are in walking distance, which was an important part when considering people's accessibility. But there's more that goes into it as well. My project objectives were to assess the accessibility of cool zones in surrounding communities, which was shown in the map already seen. Determine a vulnerability score for cool zones for the communities existing around cool zones, and to create a profile of vulnerable communities around existing cool zones to inform how to increase suitability. And lastly, to make recommendations to San Diego County officials on how to improve cool zones for heat-vulnerable populations. I've talked about vulnerability having an important impact, so let's look at who's most vulnerable to heat exposure. I chose 7 different populations, but these should not be considered exhaustive as far as vulnerability goes. So I chose people without access to a vehicle, people living below the poverty line, people without a high school diploma, adults 65 and older, children 5 and younger, pregnant people, and people living with a disability. All of these are known to impact someone's vulnerability to heat exposure. Initially, I just pulled in data from the American Community Survey, which is population data by census tract for each of these vulnerabilities. These initial maps show 6 of the 7 vulnerabilities, with the darker colors indicating a higher percentage of the population being vulnerable. I then combined these vulnerability factors to create a vulnerability index, which measures the relative vulnerability in each represented census tract. And again, darker colors indicate more vulnerable populations. However, that information alone isn't as helpful as being able to have just a clear breakdown of where the most vulnerable communities are. So I took the mean of the vulnerability index for each cool zone and then divided it into 3 equal groups, high, medium, and low, so that there can be kind of a clear way to prioritize which communities deserve, should have access to these resources first. And just to make sure that this was showing what I hoped it was, I created a distribution that shows the population of people experiencing the vulnerability does shift as we go from high, medium to low, which means that this is a pretty good representation of what it's supposed to show. Having just the information on high, medium, and low isn't helpful when we're deciding what resources should go into cooling centers. So for each cooling center, which means that there's 96 of these in total, but I just have 3 for you to look at, there's a scorecard with the vulnerability score showing if it's high, medium, or low, and then a breakdown of the percentage of people experiencing each vulnerability. And the reasoning behind this is because people, say, in a cool zone where the population is primarily people 65 and older, are going to need different resources than people at a cool zone where the primary vulnerable populations are people without a high school diploma or people living in poverty. So this allows decision makers to kind of specialize the resources that they're putting into these communities. And just to tie this back to extreme heat, I created a predictive temperature map that includes impervious surfaces. This isn't a perfect map, but basically the main point is that in these kind of urbanized areas along the coast here, we have the red temperatures indicating higher heat. This is because impervious surfaces just absorb the heat and cause it to stick around longer, increasing the impacts of those high temperatures. And we can see that our most vulnerable communities are in the areas with the highest temperatures. The last objective for my project was recommendations for improvement. So once the vulnerability scores were determined, the final step was kind of thinking about how we can make them better. And I decided to break it down into 3 categories and provide a brief example for each one. So the 3 recommendations are increasing awareness, increasing access and utilization, and standardizing operations. For increasing awareness, informational campaigns and outreach efforts should target the most vulnerable communities. As mentioned before, unhoused people, like in the talk before, unhoused people are a particularly vulnerable community that I wasn't able to look at specifically, but they require very specialized outreach because most alerts that go out are on phones, on the internet, on TV, and so during heat emergencies, unhoused people are typically not even aware that they're happening and that there's this increased level of risk. So knowing where these communities are located can help with determining how determining the best way to get that information out there. Increasing access and utilization. Providing free public transportation during extreme heat events would be a really effective way to reduce these heat-related illnesses. It allows people to not walk to get where they're going, and if they don't have time to get to a cool zone, then they can at least cool down on the buses, which all have AC that should be functioning. If you've been on a bus where it's not functioning, it's not fun, but normally it works. And then cool zones are really kind of not understood. There's not information on who's using them or who's not using them and why people aren't using them. We do know they're not really exciting places to be. There's kind of a stigma associated, so those are jumping off points, but until there's data collected and surveys put out into communities on what's really preventing people from getting there, it's going to be hard to create a model that's going to have the biggest impact. So that's definitely important for future research. And then standardizing operations. Right now, there's certain locations like libraries in San Diego County that are automatically designated as cool zones, and then other locations can apply. But there aren't really any requirements except for have AC, be open to the public for free, that's it. But one important function of cool zones is to provide cooling in the event of a power outage. But San Diego cool zones aren't required to have a backup generator, so this means they wouldn't be able to do that. And so basically, there just needs to be a consistent operating requirement for all cool zones, a minimum thing that people can expect when they go there. They have AC, you can get water, there's going to be some food, there might be some social services there that can help you access other resources. And this kind of ties into providing targeted programming to make cool zones more enjoyable. People don't want to sit in an empty room. And people who maybe don't have their high school diploma or are older, they can benefit from community programming that can be run in these centers that makes them enjoyable places to be, where they're not just sitting around wasting their time. And the key takeaways: understanding the spatial distribution of vulnerable populations informs decision makers on community needs. And cool zones are life-saving resources that should be easily accessible to vulnerable community members. I think that this project is a good starting point for providing some of that information, but there's lots that we still need to learn, and so hopefully people can continue working towards that in the future. And I want to say thank you to my Capstone Advisory Committee, Dr. Tarik Benmarhnia, Anna Dimitrova, and Cheryl Peach, all of whom were essential to getting this project done. I want to thank my family and friends, who I couldn't have done it with also, and my amazing cohort members. I did not think that I would leave with 21 new friends, so I'm really happy that I chose this program. Thank you all.
Well done, Isabella. That was a really fantastic presentation.
You.
Can you speak to the funding that is involved with government-authorized or supported cooling centers, and maybe what might need to be done to provide them more money?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one of the initiatives in the state of California is actually to create community resilience centers, and the idea is that these places would be open year-round and offer relief to all different kinds of climate disasters, whether it's wildfire or like air pollution, extreme heat. And I think that funding for that could be really essential in creating cooling centers that are really effective, because once these methods are piloted, and if they really help strengthen communities, then I think people will be more likely to put the funding into the other cooling centers to get the resources there.
Great job, first of all. And as you were speaking, I kind of started to wonder about shelters and if those were often designated as cooling centers for the houseless population during heat waves.
That's a good question. I didn't look into shelters specifically. There weren't any on the list of cool zones in San Diego, so in San Diego, no. Shelters might have their own outreach efforts during heat emergencies that just aren't coordinated with the county. But shelters are a super important component, because for people who don't have AC at home, with increasing nighttime temperatures, they can't even cool off when they're at home at night, which gets really dangerous. So having cool zones with extended operating hours will be really important for the shelter aspect as well.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I do think your work is definitely like a powerful tool to provide information for decision makers here in San Diego. And I'm just curious about your thoughts of next steps. Do you think about providing this material to organizations, to the county?
Yeah, so I'm supposed to have a meeting with the county. They haven't gotten back about scheduling it yet, but ideally this information will go to the county so that they can incorporate it while they're making plans on how to tackle their heat response strategies.
This is kind of tied to Clara's previous presentation, but are there any crime-related risk with cool zones?
I didn't see any in any of the studies, but like I said, as far as like the utilization aspect goes, there's not a lot of information out there. I think because they're not really used right now, there's just also not really a lot of opportunities for crime, but if they were to become more popular, then there would definitely need to be, you know, ways to guarantee security. And I know Corey mentioned before, like guaranteeing that like undocumented people can feel safe and they don't have to worry about being reported to immigration or anything like that. So as they expand, those types of measures would really need to be a part of making the like regulations better for them.
Just out of curiosity, does the list of designated cool zones only include public spaces, or could a private place like a food court apply to be designated as one?
The list does include private places, because like one of the places is the Solano Nature Center, I think, and there's a couple of other like independent organizations. But when I did the analysis of like what the categories are, I think 83% of them are libraries. So a lot of outreach needs to be done to these types of like private community organizations to encourage them and maybe incentivize them with some funding opportunities to open their doors to people during extreme heat events.